Sometimes when you go to do something, things don't go the way you thought they would. I set out to make this film to introduce all of you to Expedition Camp at Camp Peniel and Wilderness Camp, and every turn, every plan I made, I had to adjust things. I'd like to invite you to join me on an expedition canoe trip through several regions in southwest Nova. First off, I want to take you to Bond Island. And as you can see, as I was heading over there, the wind and the waves were way up, and there was a good 2-foot swell running here. I was offered rescue several times by fishermen in the Argyle area. They're good people. In this film, we'll paddle and camp and cook and explore. Maybe it'll serve to whet your appetite for Expedition Camp 2021. When we look at it, a lot of people think of the open canoe, and they don't think of it as being a craft fit for open water or ocean. And I have to disagree. This is a canoe that I built a long time ago, and I kind of built it to be the canoe for all waters, and it'll handle ocean swells, and it'll handle rivers and lakes and big wind, as well as varying currents and cross currents. And paddling over to Bond Island across the Argyle River, you're on to some channels that are open to open water, and there's a different feel to the canoe. You can see in these pictures I was trying to make my way to Bond Island, and the swells were not running the way I was running, and so there's a lot of roll, there's a lot of back and forth, and you cannot take your knees off the bottom of the canoe in a situation like this. But as I made my way over to Bond Island, I knew it would be worth the effort to get to where all of the past year campers spent their time on this island doing survival training, doing wilderness camping. As we paddled along, I should note that I am not dangerously reckless. I did actually have a spotting boat, a safety boat shadowing me, as you can tell by the camera work. I learned to paddle the canoe up by Peggy's Cove, and I really enjoy big water. It's probably why I was drawn to whitewater as well. But as we paddle along here, it's a very strenuous thing to do, and you really can't, you can very easily bite off more than you can chew. I tried this same trip once a week before, and it was so thick in fog I didn't attempt it, because I knew I could get turned around, I could get washed out to sea, and then a 911 phone call saying, I'm in a canoe somewhere off of the Argyle River, could somebody come get me, doesn't usually get looked upon with great favor by the rescuers. When I finally arrived to Bond Island, one of the first things you've got to keep on top of is hydration. I was tired and hot. There's a stiff breeze blowing, which helped a tremendous amount, but a drink of water and getting your feet on solid ground again can feel pretty good. This beach, when I beached here, was actually at a very, very low tide. We found at Expedition Camp there were 6 fellows that camped for a week on this island, and we found that the tide gave us sometimes a big playground and sometimes not much to work with. But 6 people stayed on this island for a week last year, and as we walk around the island, you're going to see that what we teach at Wilderness Camp and at Expedition Camp is leave no trace camping, and the campers were very successful in that. There is absolutely no trace that this camp went on last year. As a tidal island, nobody could go away because it's an island, and somebody might be in a pick or be angry or whatever, and if they stomped off one direction, they'd an hour later come back from the other direction. We used to scavenge and forage through those tidal pools for extra food, and then up in the trees in here is where we had our camps and our tents and hammocks set up. We only had one campfire. We cooked over kerosene cookers, and it was a lovely time. We look forward to coming back here in 2021 to do the same trip again. Of course, with 2020, that wasn't going to happen, and so coming back to the island and beginning this journey here seemed very fitting. And as I surveyed where the hammocks once hung and remembered the ring of laughter that they used to ring out here, the good times that were shared by those who came to expedition camp, it whets my appetite for next year. As we look at these trees and all this dry kindling that's here, the island is constantly changing, and it's constantly eroding in some places and building up in others, and trees are falling down and new trees are growing. It's the nature of bushcraft and woodcraft. And another interesting factor is that there's never a perfect place to set up. You have to adjust to your surroundings, and you'll see in the following campsites that there are good sites and there are tolerable sites, but there are very few, if any, perfect sites. But looking out here, this was what was seen as people would wake up in the morning, and this was the area where many of them pitched their tents and spent their nights. One of the things that sometimes happens with an open canoe is you become windbound. One of my favorite things to do when I'm windbound, when I've got time to kill, waiting for a tide or the wind to die down, is I'll begin to look around and find a piece of wood and look at the wood and say to myself, what does that look like? Does that look like a flower? Does that look like a daisy? Does that look like a whale? And then I get out my knives and I start to whittle, and the time flies by. This particular piece of wood, I thought and still think looks like a whale surfacing up out of the water, so I began to trim and to cut and to see if I could get it out of the wood so that what it looked like. I have a soft spot for small rivers and creeks in a canoe. I lived in New Brunswick for 8 years, and I learned low water rapids basics. They're actually as dangerous or more dangerous than big water because of the dangers of being pinned or hitting your head if you dump. I don't plan on dumping, and I didn't plan on dumping, but when I went to film a lot of this, it was the middle of the summer of 2020, and the water was really too low to even run in a canoe. You know, when we look at something like this is the kind of thing you carry your canoe around, or you line it down with a rope. This is Mill Falls, and normally there's 3 extra feet of water on top of this, and it's just roaring. A word on PFDs. Wear your PFD. I grew up in a time before this, when it wasn't required, so please be a little forgiving of me if my PFD isn't always zipped up. Old habits die hard. I guess you could say I'm saying do as I say, not as I do. You know, when we look at water and it's moving though, there's a beauty that is to be found there in the foam, the rushing water. And I have to admit, as I looked at the Mill Falls and I thought to myself, well, there's a still water up above, and if I went all the way over to the other side and came back again, it'd take a lot of corrective strokes, but then there's this drop here, and I could sit and stare at rapids for hours. Stuff there's no way I could run. Even when the water is full, I couldn't run over Mill Falls. There's a good 8-foot drop at the bottom of it that the canoe just wouldn't survive. But you sit and you look and you wonder. It's a great way to spend a little bit of time when you should be out paddling or maybe setting up a camp or doing something else. But you look at those drops and you look at those pools and you think to yourself, well, I could do it. It would be fun. The water's moving. But at the end of the day, you gotta say, nope. Fire is one of those things that plays a large part of wilderness camping. One of the main skills that we teach, one of the things that everyone wants to learn, is how to make a fire. Actually, really more concerned about fire safety than fire preparation, because we don't want to make a forest fire. We don't want to lose some of the beauty that we've got here in Nova Scotia. Here in Kaji, where I was filming this, they have fire pits that are required, which is good. There was a forest fire in Kaji 2 years ago in that area that changed the look of the entire area. But the woodsman uses one match for a fire. The woodsman knows how to lay out a fire for what he needs. Campfires, cooking fires, coals, that kind of thing. Fires warm us, they light up the site, they keep critters big and small away, and of course we can cook over them. You know, there's something about fresh air, exercise, being active, that just brings up a whale of an appetite. I eat more and am hungrier when I'm out doing this kind of thing than I ever am when I'm home. And everything cooked over a fire tastes better. That's something you can take to the bank, something you can take home and learn about. Now, in a campfire, coals are king. Flames are what everyone loves, but coals are better for cooking, and they make less smoke. In media like film, there's so much missing. Maybe you've sat by a softwood fire waiting for supper before, and this section might bring back a memory of a delightful smell, cooking, and wood smoke. Maybe your mouth is watering a little bit as you're realizing something really good is going to be prepared on this. That's a good thing. The point of this film is to try to whet your appetite for more wilderness time, dirt time as we call it. When I was preparing for expedition camp last year, there was some confusion on the gear list that I put together for them to bring with them to Bond Island. One of the items that they were each to bring is a pot with a bale on it. You see, at expedition camp, and when you're out even on your own, you don't have a camp cook. At wilderness camp, we've got Alan, and he cooks fantastic meals for the kids and the chuck wagon, and we have a big steel grill and all the rest. But when you're out, just you in the canoe, and you're out in the wilderness, there isn't anyone going to make supper for you. And so one of the things, in another meal I use a frying pan here, but oftentimes your most versatile piece of cookware is a pot with a bale. Now, you see this pot that I'm using here. It doesn't have a handle on it like a kitchen pot. If it had a plastic handle sticking off the side, then that handle would melt, or if it was metal, it would get too hot to lift and this kind of thing. So there's a bale, there's a handle that goes across the top that I can suspend over a fire. And it's a far more versatile piece of equipment than a pan would be, or a canteen cup, or a coffee can, or any of those kinds of things. I can boil water in it, I can cook in it, I can make a stew, I can fry things up and then make soup or whatever. I can actually use this for so much more than a regular pan might work. Sausages from Laquille. As I was cutting these up, these are homemade sausages, and my mouth was watering and the fire was crackling, and I was thinking to myself, after a long day of paddling and filming and traveling, I was ready for supper and wanted this to cook up as quick as possible. Now, it never cooks as quick as you would want it to when you're hungry, but it does cook, and the smells are quite delightful. Just a note about the cooking you see me doing here. The magic of the screen is such that you'll notice both my hands are occupied here, and the camera sometimes moves. I wouldn't eat this much just myself. I actually had a cameraman there with me, and I was feeding him too, and in most of the meals you'll see me cook, there's usually enough for two, and that's because I'm feeding those that are helping me with this. I was pushing it a little bit. This fire wasn't really ready to cook on yet. It was actually still burning too hot, but I was hungry. And the wind was blowing it just right, and there was the firebox there, so I started cooking up anyhow.
sausages, rice, chickpeas with curry sauce. That was a good supper. It stuck to your ribs and filled you up after a long day of filming. Cooking is best done when you're hungry. My mom always said appetite is the best sauce. This was just what I needed after a long day, and it made for a very good meal, end of the day, and gave me the energy I needed to stay warm that night.
When the canoe is moving on the water, there's a lot of things happening. The paddle is interacting with the water as I'm paddling. There's every action, there's an opposite reaction, so if I'm paddling on the right side, which I do, the canoe always goes to the left, so I use a J-stroke to bring it back to the right. But I love to see the bow cutting through the water. I made that bow. I created the lines for it, and I love to see it slicing through the water, especially when the water's very still. It doesn't get much better than a coastline like this. As you're paddling up into a remote lake, there's nobody around, there's just the birds and the wind. You find a simpatico between the canoe and the paddle and yourself. And it enables you to take your mind off the hook. You're using muscles, you're doing something physical, which then sets your mind free. Some of my best praying is done in a canoe in times like this. I love the symbolism that's apparent there too, that indeed the canoeist doesn't sit on the seats. The canoeist puts his knees on the floor and assumes the posture of prayer. Very often, I find the Lord when I'm on my knees in the canoe. When you stop and you look out, looking for that perfect campsite that doesn't exist, sometimes you see things you can take advantage of. Two trees that are the right space apart, just perfect for an afternoon break on a hot day. Whipping out the hammock and setting it up, I thought to myself that this would be a great time to take a break. This was August 2020, so it was hot. I was hot, and the thought of swinging, hanging with the breeze underneath me, cooling me off, was a delightful one. You'll notice too that I use straps on the trees. That's to help preserve the trees so that a rope like parachute cord or nylon rope would bite into the bark, which can actually kill a tree. But the straps are wider and they distribute the load a little bit better so that it's able to not harm the tree. Address something here that everybody seems to be afraid of these days. I've had so many people say to me they wouldn't dare go out into the woods because of ticks. It reminds me of when I was a kid. There were friends of mine that wouldn't swim in lakes because of leeches. And you can't live in fear like that. One of the things a lot of people don't realize is that most ticks actually live in tall grass, meadows, dry grass, those kinds of areas. There's ticks out in the woods here too. But the low brush around my legs there was ferns with moss underneath it. The trees were hardwood, and so there wasn't a whole lot of brush up underneath it and everything like this. And I checked myself over regularly, looking for ticks. And when you are into a place like that and you grow comfortable there, I would be far more anxious walking generally from my vehicle across some tall grass to a beach on the ocean, or somebody's lawn that hadn't been mowed, I'm sure to pick up some ticks there. But here in the woods, I can tell you, in all of summer 2020, filming in and out of the woods, hanging in hammocks, camping out, I didn't have a single tick on me this year. And that's a good thing. Now, that's not to say I won't. That's not to say that one might bite me that has Lyme disease. But we deal with that as it comes. But to hang out here is well worth any risk that ticks might have. Now, you may notice too that I wear water shoes or Crocs, and I have my pant legs usually tied up. That's because I'm in and out of the canoe a lot, and I like to stay fairly dry. Skin is waterproof, and so I can get in and out of the canoe, but it also means I can see or feel a tick that might be on my legs far sooner than I could if my pant legs were down and I had shoes and socks on. Being out in the wilderness sure does bring up an appetite. And so as I had pulled over on the beach, was done with the hammock, and decided to make up some lunch. Some people are so organized, lightweight hikers and the like. They have everything in its specific place. And my gear that I carry, I know what's in there, but it's really quite a bit of chaos. And so you'll see that I have to hunt through my bags to get what I want. But I'm checking off mental checklists. Food is in this bag, stove is in this bag. I need fuel for the stove. The red bag has got my fire making kit in it. And I have a little wood stove so that in case there's a fire ban on, as there was at this point, I can still have a fire and cook. I've started using, a couple of years ago, the little alcohol burners. And that's a great way to get into it. You can use gasoline antifreeze, which you can get at the gas station for next to nothing, and just even take an old pop tin and cut it in half and pour it in, and you have a stove. You might have to hang your stuff over it, but what I use is a little Trangia stove that's got a built-in pot stand on it, but there's no moving parts, no noise, and it heats things up really quickly and really well. Again, there's another pot with a bail. This now on the menu there today was chicken and rice, cappuccino. A lot of people, you give them a tin of meat and they don't really know what to do with it unless there's a pull tab on it. And then they carry a Swiss Army knife and they aren't really sure how the can opener works. Well, it's a finicky thing, but it does work. And you've got to go all the way around it and pry it open, and basically you're cutting little death by 1,000 cuts for the poor can. But you go all the way around and you hook that on and you come through, and then you can open up your can like that. You'll notice as well, just before I did this, I drained the liquid off of the chicken into the pot. That goes in where the rice is going to go, because there's really good nutrients and really good flavor that come from that as well. You learn not to waste things, you learn to make do with what you've got. So you've gone all the way around the can and you just take all the bits that you missed out, and then you can get into where the good stuff is. MacGyver would be proud. If you're hungry and in a hurry, this can be a little frustrating. Cappuccino, chicken and rice. Good eats. The little pyramid thing there is a pocket cooker. It's a little wood stove that enables me to have a campfire even if there's a fire ban on. So many times I show cooking around a fire, cooking a meal, cooking and doing these things, but there's something else that also has to be done after every meal. You gotta be clean. You gotta be healthy. You got to wash your dishes, and you don't always have to carry soap, because on the shore you got sand. Well, you scour your pots out with sand and rinse them out and let them dry out good, and you're all set for the next meal. In a world fascinated with cleanliness, this is actually very clean. All the food bits are taken off, and every time I cook with it, the units are sterilized and sanitized by the heat that I cook over. Dishes don't seem like such a chore when you're only cleaning up for one or two. You have a pot, a cup, and some sort of a dish and a spoon or fork or whatever it might be like that. The dishes get done very quickly and you can move on to the next thing. Cleaning everything up, putting it back in the canoe again, and leaving a campsite with no trace gives you a feeling of satisfaction. It's to do something, to complete something, not to do things halfway, not to leave things unfinished, but rather to set out with a plan to do things in a right and proper way. It gives a feeling of satisfaction. You paddle away from a clean campsite, it gives you that knowledge of knowing that you didn't do it halfway. You did it the right way. You may notice that when I'm in a canoe, I paddle on the right side. There's a reason for this. As a Canadian paddler, I don't switch sides. There are various schools and styles of paddling, but the Canadian manner is to use corrective strokes, proper corrective strokes so you don't lose momentum, and to paddle on one side of the canoe. And it just happens that even though I'm left-handed, I just got used to paddling on the right side, and that's where I'm comfortable. I used to switch sides when I was a young person. I learned how to paddle on a lake behind my house in Halifax County, and I boarded everyone's canoe that I could borrow. And I would switch sides, and I could pretty much make a canoe go where I wanted it to go. But a good friend of mine, Andy Elliott, taught me how to use corrective strokes when I was working at Bayside Camp. And it took a while for it to take, but when it did, it really took. And the J stroke is your foundation stroke for correcting, box strokes and Indian strokes and all kinds of different braces and pries and all the rest. A canoe is actually really easier to paddle when you're solo, once you get used to it. Tandem, you have a bow person and a stern person, and it takes a lot of teamwork. A good bow paddler is worth their weight in gold. As I paddled across this lake, you can see the canoe sort of zigzagging a little bit back and forth. That's because every time you paddle on the right side, the canoe wants to go to the left. And so you put a little flip at the end of your paddle in your J-stroke, and that brings you back to the right again, which keeps you in a straight line. And it enables you to travel great distances and to manage with the wind and have no problem. Occasionally, I will switch over to the left side if the wind is just contrary enough to make me do so, but my preference in many ways, it feels very uncomfortable for me to paddle on the other side, and so I've developed so that I can paddle all day long on the right side, and it's no strain for me at all. This wooden canoe typifies so much for me. I prefer natural materials when I can get them. I could have a carbon fiber or Kevlar canoe with aluminum gunnels, and it would probably last forever and only weigh 35 pounds. But this old beauty is about 20 years old. It's made out of white pine, fiberglass. It's heavy. I actually carved the word penance on the center thwart. You don't want to carry it very far. Actually, I have a set of wheels for carrying it. But once you put it in the water, it's warm and responsive, and it does not feel like it's almost 100 pounds. It paddles like a Cadillac. A wooden paddle, a wooden canoe, the warmth that's there. I've paddled in January with ice on either side of a river many times, and the canoe is warm. You contrast that to a Kevlar or aluminum or any of these other new modern boats, and they're cold and they're noisy, even though they're lightweight. I guess everything has its place. But for me, I'll keep dragging my heavy old canoe. I've got a thing going with this canoe. Every scratch on the bottom, every replaced gunnel, every replaced decking, all the things that I've done to it, tell me about the rivers I've paddled down, the adventures I've had with it. You know, when you're paddling along, adventure is what people tend to look for. Bill Mason did what he said in his movie Water Walker, that he actually pitched his movie to the National Film Board, and they thought, yeah, this is great, you know, we could have hillbillies or wolves or something and have an antagonist, and he got out of there quick. And I'm of the same mind with him. Adventure, there's enough adventure learning how to do things for yourself. There's enough adventure in being able to paddle your canoe and know that you're going to be able to keep it upright, even though you might make a tough crossing across from Bond Island to Argyle. There's enough adventure in cooking your own food and sleeping out overnight and going to wild areas. The adventure is the waterfall you might want to see, or the 3 or 4 days away from the rat race, or some of the wildlife that you might see. When you're out on a trip like this, there are surprises, and then there are surprises. And some surprises you want. There are good surprises, like coming across something you didn't expect. An old author who wrote a book called From Catadyne to the Allagash, it's also entitled My Wilderness, wrote this about surprises and about things that you find, and I found similar things on some of my trips this summer. He writes, early morning when the fog hangs low is in many respects the finest hour along the Allagash. Details are distorted until promontories, even colorless downed logs, take on bizarre forms. Objects come into focus and then quickly fade away as in a land of fantasy. This morning my talkative old guide was silent, matching the mood of the river. We moved noiselessly, thick clouds embracing us briefly, only to release us to a new vista. Once we came upon a moose feeding in a bogan. A bogan is a slack-water cove in a bend of the river, sometimes lying behind an island, sometimes fed by a brook. Moose seem to like bogans for the underwater plants. Square-tailed trout often congregate there. The moose we saw that morning lifted his head, eyed us nervously, stepped out of the bogan, and quickly disappeared. But a kingfisher who had been diving in the bogan was unconcerned at our passing. The next bogan showed 2 Virginia deer. We were almost on them before they bounded away, flashing white, saucy tails. Now the fog lifted, giving a ceiling of several hundred feet. As the skies brightened, the islands we'd been passing took on distinction, each having a personality of its own. Yet common to each were small, graceful elms that had some of New England's dignity. We kept in an outside swift channel that swept in a half circle around one island, and entered a narrow stretch of dark, purling water. Instantly, the place was filled with a tantalizing fragrance. In pantomime, I asked the old guide what it was. "Sweet grass," he whispered. We both stopped paddling, drifting in the current as we breathed deeply. The delicate perfume of sweet grass saturated the air. The sweet grass of rivers is Heriocole odorata. Herios is Greek for sacred, Chloe for grass. Sweet scented grass is strewn before churches in Europe on saints' days. American Indians used it in weaving. We beached the canoe to walk in this grass that had a faint vanilla odor. Yet when I put a handful of it to my nose, the smell was gone. Blade by blade, bunch by bunch, it seemed no different in odor from any broad-leaved grass. It took an acre of it, or long stretches next to running water, to fill the air with its fragrance. When you're in an area and you have something like this that you come across, that sweetness, that unexpected smell, the cry of a loon at evening, or a big bullfrog jumping down in front of you, they're all treasured memories. They're all adventures that you carry with you, that you take with you forward. And when you're paddling and you come across something like that, sometimes it really helps to have somebody like the old guide in that passage that I just read for you, who knows what it is that you're smelling or seeing or whatever that might be. Sometimes it can be good too if you see a little baby bear, if the old guide says, "Don't go near that." I can remember taking kids in my canoe out at Bayside Camp, and one time we saw baby otters. Well, the problem with baby otters is that mama otter is around, and mama otter will take your finger off if you get too near her babies, and so they needed me to be their old guide. I find when I'm out paddling, and I find actually the older I get, the less in a hurry I am. I used to kill myself paddling to knock off the miles, to get a little bit further, to go to the next campsite, or to make it to such and such a place by such and such a time. But now I find that there's great joy in taking a break on a hot day to cool yourself off, and to take a little break and to smell the roses or the sweetgrass, as it might be. And all these little adventures, like the moose on the Allagash, which I didn't see, or deer that you might see, or animals and all these kinds of things, the flora and the fauna, the plants and the animals, they're all adventures. And they all call us back to realize that it could never have been just an accident that these things happened. As I was filming this, I didn't see very many animals in summer of 2020. I did see this little fella. I helped him off the hot rock and into the water so he could go. I saw nettles, and I saw lots of wildflowers, and smelled the sweet grass, and had a generally wonderful time. You may not always see animals, but if you learn what to look for in plants, you'll see lots to find. Wildflowers, tall grasses, nettles, even when you go looking for them a little closer, things like mushrooms and lichens and mosses. Now, I make it a policy personally. I don't eat mushrooms. I'm not sure of what mushroom does what. The only one I'm actually sure of, two actually, one would be chicken of the woods, and the other would be chaga. But beyond that, I leave them alone. When you put it all together, and you're moving forward in the canoe, and things are going well, and you find a good spot, a spot you want to be out on, you find yourself coming back there from time to time. The other thing too is there's a different pace to the wilderness. It goes slower than regular life. You see the point that you want to get around, you know the wind's going to be over there, you get time to make adjustments and keep paddling, and you find a rhythm in the paddle. You find a rhythm in setting up camp. You find a rhythm in making supper and then falling asleep. You find a rhythm in getting up and breaking camp down and getting going again. And when you put it all together, wilderness camp is about doing that sort of with a lot of help. Expedition camp is about doing that with a little bit of help. And when you actually get out on your own or in a small group and you have just you and the canoe and the gear that you brought with you, there is a good feeling that comes from it. And you end up finding a rhythm to the paddle, a rhythm to the campsite, and it's a wonderful time. When the sun is shining and there's not much wind and you're traveling along, you don't have to be anywhere anytime soon. It can actually be pretty wonderful. Then again, it rains sometimes too. There's an axiom in wilderness travel: prepare for the worst and expect the best. When you do that, it really sets you up well so that you're able to enjoy it when you have a beautiful day, but that when it does rain or you're windbound or you forgot your favorite can of tinned ham or something and everything seems to be going downhill, then it actually works out well for you because you've done the proper previous planning. We teach that a lot at wilderness camp and expedition camp. The 7 P's. Kids have been brought up on it. My kids have been brought up on it, and the kids at wilderness camp and the rest have too. Proper previous planning prevents pretty poor performance. And those 7 P's, if you live by them, it means that sometimes you end up having a few trips where you've got way too much gear, or you discover on another trip that you've got duplicates of all your gear. And it also means you become a bit of a gear nut. You start tearing your gear apart and rearranging it and doing different things with it, and it becomes entertainment in itself. Sometimes I'll go on a trip and I'll realize, especially with the canoe, other than hiking, when you're hiking you have to carry it on your back, but when it's with the canoe, you can put the extra gear in there. And I'll come back from a trip and I'll go through my gear and think, I didn't use that, not even once. And so it gets put on a shelf in my man cave and it gets on a debate pile as to whether or not it'll come with me. Another trip I might use it and it goes back into the pack again. This beach doesn't exist in other years. The summer of 2020 was so dry that areas that would just be a little bit of about 1.5 feet of sand on the beach, which you could land on, actually became lovely pebble beaches where I could drag the canoe up and I could spend some time and eventually, in this case, I decided I was going to spend the night. You know, it's interesting with setting camp up. I don't usually think too much beforehand. I'll find a spot that looks good, 2 trees that are the right distance apart, and string up my line. The first thing that goes up is the tarp. And the reason for that is that, especially if it's raining or it looks like it might rain, if you put the tarp up first, everything else can stay dry. But you put the tarp up and you realize, there's another tree right in the way. Well, you work around that and you work around other things and you set it up, and I enjoy the MacGyvering of setting up a camp. I don't think twice about doing it beforehand. I just pull into a good spot and do it. But tearing down camp, that's another thing entirely. I'll lay in my hammock for hours at night, tearing down camp, figuring out how I'm going to do it, what I've got to do first, what has to come down next. And I'll do that 5-6 times in my sleep, in my dreams, and then I'll get up in the morning. When I'm getting up in the morning, I'll sit and I'll think about that again for another while. And then finally I get up and I do it. It's not half as bad as I thought it was going to be. Not sure why, but tearing down is a lot more stressful to me than setting up. Once you get that tarp up, there's a good feeling. You know that you've got a shelter in place. And most people who tent or stay in cabins and the like would think, well, that's not much of a shelter. But for we who hammock, that tarp is all you need. My hammock has a bug net in it, the one that I use in buggy season, so when I climb into that, I'm protected from the bugs. I can escape into that. But at the very least, shelter, all shelter is something over your head to keep the rain or the snow or the wind off of you so that you can do what you need to do and stay dry. In these videos you'll see many times me pawing through my gear. Some people are so super organized, they've got all their gear in one place and they know everything has a place and they know exactly where it is. And I use my gear a lot. And I pack and repack and I pretty much know where everything is, but it seems like every time I go out, I have to open up all the bags and find out where everything is and figure it out from there. In this case it was tent bags, tent stakes, guy stakes, support lines, whatever. Because it's so quiet in the wilderness, your situational awareness goes way up. You stop, you hear something that's not quite registering right, and it takes your attention for a minute. And so every now and then you'll see me sort of bird dog my head up and look around and listen. I heard something, probably nothing. It might have been just a bird in a tree next to me, or it might have been something farther away. But because your ear isn't tuned to it just yet, you find yourself having your attention drawn away. And it's the same with nighttime. When you're laying down the first couple nights in the wilderness in your hammock or in your tent or whatever to go to sleep, every little twig snap, every leaf that rustles, every noise that is made stirs you up, wakes you up. And that's pretty normal. The idea that humans would get 8 hours of sleep every night uninterrupted is a fairly modern convention. Most people used to have to take a turn at a watch. They used to have to get up, keep the fire going. They'd be worried about predators and different things. And so they would take cat naps. They would sleep for 2 or 3 hours, and then they would wake up for 20 minutes, and then they would sleep for 2 or 3 hours. And they also lived from dawn till dusk. And at nighttime, they would be doing indoor work, and they would be doing different things. And we can actually thrive with that too. What usually happens is by the second night, you end up having an ear that's tuned to it, so you know that the partridge that's living just up the hill from you in the spruce trees is going to cluck and make different noises at night, and your brain just tunes it right out. A human being can overcome anything, can get used to anything, and it's a wonderful thing when you're actually in the wilderness and your ear is able to do that for you. When I was a young fella growing up, I had cousins that lived in Pictou, and New Glasgow is just over across the water from them there, and there's a pulp mill there. We used to go down and visit in Pictou, and we'd hold our nose and go, "P.U., what a terrible smell." And they'd look at us and say, "What? What smell?" They couldn't smell the pulp mill at all. Now this next little bit, and I have to confess, I've mentioned a couple of times to you, I have camera people that are there with me, so I'm not technically alone when I'm doing this. But Jonathan Can was my cameraman at this time, and he thought this next little bit was insanely funny for some reason. I'm not exactly sure what it was that struck him so funny, but it does demonstrate persistence. And so I was setting up this right-hand corner of my tarp, and I wanted it to be lifted up higher so I could see the lake. And so I was going to put a stick, or I did put a stick in underneath it to elevate it so that when I was laying in the hammock, I could look out at the lake that night. But as I said earlier, there are no perfect campsites. There are only ones that you make do with. And I probably couldn't have done what I'm about to do here if the wind was up, but because it was so still and so lovely, I was able to do this after some finagling. You know, there's a spirit of MacGyver that goes with you that we try to instill and to teach to our young people when we get them out into the wilderness. And it's exaggerated even more when it's just you out in the wilderness. You might want to do something and you find a piece of wood and you figure it out and you know what you're going to do, and then you have to persist or find another way to do it. In this case, I am a stubborn man, so I persisted. And the peg would come out and the pole would fall down and the pole would fall down and the peg would come out, but eventually I did get it and get it to where I wanted it to do. And yes, that's the left-hand side line that just let go there too. It just required a few more rocks and a little bit more persistence, and actually I am not a cursing man, so I did not use any words I should not have used here, but I will say the laugh track with Jonathan was rather funny. There are lots of comments usually about my bright red kit that my fire kit is in. I understand that it is bright red to most people who see it, but I don't see it very well as being colorblind, so for me it's as bright as I can get it so that I can actually find it, but it's not actually red, it's actually brown to me. That'll do. One of the things I do like about tarps and hammocks is that when you set them up properly, if you have a big tarp like this and lots of room to set up, there's very open inside them. You can stand up and move around. You're not hemmed in like you are in a tent. A word about water. I use resublimated iodine to purify water. I also boil things before I generally use them. In this day and age, you have to have some sort of treatment for your water so that you can actually avoid getting sick. The sicknesses you might get are dysentery or giardia or things like that, and it's important to know that they're there and to realize that the bygone days are no more. When I was a young fellow, nobody carried a canteen or a bottle, and we would have laughed if you had said that people would buy bottled water. But back then we carried a cup, and you dipped your cup in the lake or river or whatever, preferably a river, and you drank right from the lake or the river, and you could do that in the 1970s. Somewhere along there, acid rain and pollution and all these different things came up, and in fact we ended up having to have other means to purify water. I get a lot of comments on my little red axe hatchet. It's a double-bitted canoe hatchet, technically. It was made in Texas, and I'd been wanting one for a long time. Most hatchets and camp hatchets are either too light or too heavy, and I have a camp axe that's just about perfect and this, but I wanted a double-bitted one for in the canoe. For campsites like this, it's light and nimble. By nimble, what I mean is I can swing it, And I can hit the mark where I want to hit every single time I swing it, pretty much, because it's a very light hatchet. Now, you're not going to cut down trees and build a log cabin with it, but I keep one blade really, really sharp, which I can use to cut things like a knife, and the other one has a different kind of an edge on it, which is a cutting edge or an axe edge, and I can use that to chop. It only takes one or two swings to figure out which edge I'm using. But when you're gathering wood like this, when you're processing stuff, when you're getting things ready, you could use a knife and a baton to do some of these chores, but the hatchet makes it a lot easier and the right tool for the right job. A saw works just as well, and actually will make cleaner ends and this kind of thing, but really for gathering firewood, for making a tripod, as I will in a few minutes, this hatchet does the job beautifully. So when you're gathering wood for your campfire and tinder and the like, you have to basically you have to gather as much as you think you're going to need, and then double that, and then maybe go back for some more. Now, if you're making a campfire for all night, you need probably as much as you think you're going to need, and about 3 times that amount. A stack of wood that you've cut down or maybe split and this kind of thing is as high as your waist, as big around as your arms, twice over maybe, might work for that, and then as well, your tinder to get your fire going. Now, I was only going to be making a cooking fire, not a campfire. I wasn't going to have a fire all night long, so I gathered enough wood for me to cook the pork chops and the rice and the meal that I was going to make. And I did so, and then I put together this crankshaft cook set. Now, we teach this one at Wilderness Camp, and it's a lovely way to go. This dials in with what I was saying earlier about a pot with a bail. A pot that has a bail across the top you can suspend over the fire. The frying pan needs something underneath it to hold it in the fire, but I can put a cast iron frying pan into the fire, whereas I don't really want to do that so much with my pot. So I built this little tripod, and one of them is not attached to the other two, and I will put the hook that's holding the pot on that, and then I can rotate it to raise or lower the pot over the fire. My survival instructor Ron Hood, who I learned a lot of things from, basically taught us how to do this in his Solar Survival DVD, and I've been using it ever since. A fellow named Radio Ray was with him on that particular DVD, and it's called the Radio Ray Crankshaft Cook Set, and it works really, really well. So you tie your 2 front pieces together and just lean your third one up against it, and then you'll see I'll have a string with the trigger that holds the pot over the fire. Now here's where I get back and get even with that stick that gave me so much trouble earlier. I need a stick with a fork in it so that I can actually use it to hold the pot over the fire. So I start off by tying the rope to the crankshaft, and then I'll tie the trigger to that, and where it's above the pot, it'll get scorched a little bit. Depending on how good I am at cooking. If I put the pot over there with too many flames, it can really burn the cord and the hook. But most times, cooking over coals, cooking the way you want to cook, you can get a week, 2 weeks of worth of use out of one pot hook and cable. So where did I get my trigger? I got my trigger from the annoying stick. I have a chain with a hook on the end of it at my campsite, my regular permanent campsite that I spend a lot of time at, because the chain won't burn and the hook is metal. But you don't really want to carry that kind of stuff out with you like this all the time, so learning to make do is a wonderful skill. That learning to make do means that I don't have to carry the metal with me. I can rather keep to natural materials, and I can do as I like that way. The one consumable that you'll end up using a lot of is cordage. So we teach teach a number of C's for survival: container, the pot with the bale; combustion, the fire; cover, the tarp; and cordage is a big one. Now, I'm not going to get into it in this film, but there's so much to learn on making natural cordage. You can take grass and knot it properly, and you can make a fairly strong cord to set up tarps with and things like this. But generally speaking, most campers, most bushmen, most woodsmen like what's called parachute cord. Parachute cord, the real stuff, is rated for 550 pounds, and it's just a little thicker than a shoelace. And inside it there's 7 or 8 strands of other polyester cordage, and you can take it apart and you can multiply your length of your cordage by 7 or 8 times. It's lightweight, it's easy, and it disappears like candy when you have kids around. And they absolutely adore this stuff, and they'll use it and use it and use it. If you see it on sale, it's not a bad thing to pick up 50 feet, 100 feet of it and keep it in your kit. I always have lots and lots of it because I end up giving a lot of it away to children. But just a word of caution, and I endorse and I tell people that they can go to the dollar store for a lot of things. The dollar store parachute cord is, generally speaking, not it's not 550 cord. It has a different kind of liner inside of it. That being said, it's cheap and it works very, very well for this kind of thing. The other kind of rope that I use here sometimes is polypropylene rope, and usually marine supply stores and the rest can have it. It's a braided, heavy twine. So one of the things, as I was getting ready to light the fire, I realized I didn't have enough tinder and I didn't have enough wood, so I went and got some more. Now, tinder is the stuff that's smaller than a pencil. Kindling is the stuff that's the size of your finger right up to the size of your wrist. So many people light a fire and they think they'll use spark-based, or they'll use a match or whatever, and then they don't understand why when they get the fire going, it goes out again immediately. And it's because, generally speaking, they either smothered it, didn't give it enough air, or they didn't have enough tinder to get a base of coals going. So I'm using a ferrocium rod here, and it sparks up really well. You put that tinder up on top of it, and things begin to go, and then you begin to add in all of your kindling that you got and wanting to make a bed of coals for cooking on. I probably should have put the water in the pot before I hung the pot over the fire, but that's the way it goes. Or if you remember, that's purified water I put in there, and I'm going to be cooking with it, so it's going to be boiled. When I was an Army cadet, I went up to the Arctic in 1988, and I learned a very hard lesson about unpurified water. I gave my canteen to a buddy of mine to fill, and he filled both of our canteens from a pond of standing water, so there was no inlet or outlet to it. This water was just sitting there. When water just sits, it gets stuff growing in it, and we both got dysentery. Dysentery is basically uncontrollable diarrhea, and we had to hike 25 kilometers that day up the Coolic River Valley, and so we marked the trail. Every half an hour or so, everyone had to wait while we went off behind a boulder somewhere, and after a while it seems like you couldn't have anything left in you, but you do. And to avoid those kinds of things, purifying your water, being careful with your water, is actually very important. Now, because there's flames, many people would think to themselves, oh, we have a fire, I can start cooking. And yes, I do have the water suspended over it there to get some heat onto it there, but that fire was actually a little bit too hot for what was there, and I was taking a risk. I was fortunate, it didn't come down, but really, when you're cooking on a campfire, even if you're running a wood stove, coals are really what you're looking for. And so when you get your coals, you can regulate your heat much better, and you get a steadier, deeper heat. There is a cheerful aspect to a nice campfire, even when it's just coming on to dusk, and or if it's damp. Fire does so much for us. It warms us, and it lightens dark places. It cooks for us. It keeps critters away. It is a great comfort to us. It is warm though, and it was warm there that day, so it was warm sitting in front of that fire getting things ready to go. I wasn't planning on having this campfire all night. There's no need for it. The little clear plastic thing you see in front of the fire there is actually a solar powered light, and you can inflate it like that and I turn it on its low setting at night, and it'll go all night and it charges up all day. I am pretty open about the fact that I'm afraid of the dark, and if I'm staying out someplace all by myself, I find it difficult to do. And having a light on is a big help, because that way when something does wake you up, something growls or something crashes in the woods behind you, or you have to get up and go to the bathroom or something like that, especially on a night when there's no moon or if it's overcast, it can be rather unnerving and harder to fall back to sleep again. With the light on, it enables you to, when you wake up, not immediately be in the pitch dark. When we run expedition camp, we start off with them. We don't have a camp cook like we do at wilderness camp. Everyone has to cook their own food. So we start off with them issuing them military ration packs. Everybody loves military ration packs for the first day. There's sometimes even a chocolate bar in there. There's gum. There's who knows what's going to be in there. It's like a Halloween treat bag. And the food's pretty good. It's all boiled in a bag. You just need to boil water, heat things up, and you're good to go. But they're rather expensive. They tend to be $10 to $12 a meal a person, which, when you compare it to eating out in a restaurant, isn't so bad. But still, they're a bit much. So what we began to do is the first day they got ration packs. The second day, we showed them, and we gave them and showed them how to use homemade ration packs that we had made up for them. And there's generally a package of rice or noodles, one of those side dishes type things, a tin of meat, some vegetables of some sort, like dried vegetables or something like that, some crackers and some cookies, some oatmeal for the morning, and various things like that. And you can make these at the grocery store quite easily, and they cost about a little less than a tenth as much to make. So if you stop and think, a tin of meat is $1 and a side dish is $1, some trail mix is $1.50, some coffee or tea drinks is less than $1. All of these things together, a day's worth of food for one person generally is about $5. And you can stretch that out to go over more than just a day. You will have things left over. And at first they were delighted with these, and then the second and third days we got them to cook them themselves, and we started easing up on some of the extra stuff, and we began urging them to catch fish and put fish in with their rice, or gather mussels and put mussels in with their rice or their noodles and this kind of thing. And they very quickly became eager to see what they could do and who could outdo the other when it came to cooking up what they would consider to be gourmet cooking. And when you look at this, it is pretty gourmet. I mean, who brings a cast iron frying pan with them out camping? Well, the canoe carries it. I didn't carry it, so I am delighted to have my cast iron pan, my canteen cup, and my pot there. So there's rice and pork chops and coffee. I wish you could smell what's there, because there's something lovely about food cooked over a campfire. Maybe you sat around a campfire of softwood, crackling and smoking and smelling wonderful like that, and maybe this has stirred up memories for you of that. I hope it does. At this point, after supper, getting ready to turn in, setting up my sleeping pad and my hammock. Hammocks, the one thing with them is when you sleep in them, air moves underneath you, and it can give you what's called CBS, cold bum syndrome. And so by putting a dollar store yoga pad or a closed cell foam sleeping pad or taking an extra Wooby quilt like that and clothes pinning that underneath you creates a layer of a layer of insulation under you, so you don't get cold bum syndrome. But you tuck in, and in a hammock, for a long time I used to find my knees would lock and my feet would go to sleep. Before I learned to crook my legs and lay on my side, and I'm a side sleeper anyway. And then I learned how to hang asymmetrically, and you can actually lay almost perfectly flat in a hammock. And so you lay down, and it's just coming on to dusk, and you're ready for the night. And it's at this time you start hearing things. It's at this time that the stump you knew was a stump when you went to bed, as it turns to dusk, then it seems to become something else, and your imagination kicks in. And learning to turn that off is a big help. Sometimes it's easier than other times. But the canoe was close, my solar light was lit, I was able to lay in bed and be comfortable, and you find that sleep will eventually come. Another trick for going to sleep in unfamiliar places, to have a routine. When you lay down in your bed at night, you might lay on one side and turn to the other, and then you fall asleep. At this point, I'm laying on my back. I heard something. Oh, it's nothing. So I roll onto my side, and hopefully I can go to sleep. There is a peace at night. Everything that's there was still there when the sun was shining. And being able to realize that can make your brain override your imagination sometimes, and you begin to realize that things that were there at the light are still there at night. And your night vision kicks in, and you can see far better than you thought you could at night. And sometimes God leaves a night light on for us. The morning finally comes. I've been laying there thinking about what order I'll take my campsite down for a while. But there's a peace on a calm, still lake like this. I like to get up early in the mornings, get the canoe loaded and go. Because your best paddling is at dawn and at dusk. Midday, the wind comes up and it becomes more difficult. So you stretch and you get the wrinkles and the cracks out, wash your face and get underway. I'm not a breakfast person normally. I struggle with heartburn, so oatmeal is one of the things that give me the worst heartburn that I can possibly eat. But you get up in the morning and you make a cup of coffee, or you make some oatmeal if that's what you're doing. But the sooner you can get out onto that lake, I would rather stop and have a brunch or an early lunch when the wind picks up than I would to lose time in the morning. It always amazes me too how some of the gear that we have can pack down into the little bags we have for it and can be compressed down and made to be useful for us, so we can carry it without much gear. As we pack these things down, it's almost like they disappear into little bags, and we throw the little bags in the canoe and away we go. So again, the tarp is the first thing that goes up. The tarp will be the last thing that comes down. And then you patrol the campsite to find anything that you might have left behind, striving to have a leave no trace campsite. This campsite, I spent the night at it, I cooked a meal at it, I enjoyed it very much, and my goal is to leave maybe some impressions in the sand, maybe not, maybe after the first rainstorm, to have not even any tracks left, because I didn't really have much of an impact here. If it was raining, doing up the bedding first, taking the hammock down first, putting them in their bags, putting them aside where it's going to be dry, and leaving them under the tarp would mean that most of my gear could stay dry until I was ready to go. Because of that, the tarp is the last thing to get picked up. Time for him to charge up for the day. I have had tremendous results with many dollar store finds. This gray mat is just a cheap $2 yoga mat, but it weighs nothing, and it makes a world of difference in the hammock. It's waterproof, it can't be destroyed, and if I did lose it or I cut it by mistake or something like that, I'm out $2. Some things you can save money on. Other things you need to spend a little bit of extra on. So a knife would be a high-end thing, your tarp is a high-end thing, your hammock may potentially be a high-end thing too, although this is just a very economical tarp or hammock that I have and I've had for years. It's a Grand Trunk and they're about $12. But again, they pack down almost to nothing and they go into the little baggie and away you go. Tarp comes down, you know you're almost done. After that, it's just cleanup. Once your gear is all stowed away, it's then that you start cleaning up any impact you might have had behind you. Leave no trace camping is a very interesting concept. You're supposed to take nothing but pictures and leave nothing but footprints. And garbage, especially plastic garbage, is the worst thing that we're thinking of leaving behind. And so having a garbage bag with you and packing out not only your garbage but somebody else's garbage too, so you leave the wilderness pristine, is something that gives great meaning to these excursions. Taking down the tarp then means that I'm now at the mercy of the weather again. I have no more cover left other than my clothing. And that's okay, because I'm about ready to clean up the campsite and then load the canoe and go. But whereas if I was going to be staying here for several days or be fishing and returning here again, I would leave the tarp up. Everything goes into its place and into a fairly small package, and it gets loaded into the canoe. That's my entire campsite there in my left hand, my right hand. As I take down the tripod, I end up keeping the cordage. I'll use the cordage again. Having a baggie with all kinds of short pieces of cordage is very helpful because that way you're not cutting up your longer pieces of parachute cord or good cordage as often. Plus, if some kid comes and asks you for some parachute cord, you can give them a small big piece, and then that way you still have your 50-foot piece tucked away where they can't see it. Now you might look at this campsite and think, well, that's a pretty good job. Not much evidence he was there. And you look around and, of course, my ridge line for my tarp, I had forgotten. I gotta do something about that campfire. Now, a campfire with a ring of stones is what everybody always thinks of. But lake rocks have moisture in them and they can explode, so I wasn't going to use them for that. Plus, it blackens up a bunch of rocks that leaves a dirtier campsite. Now, others might come and use it, yes, that's true, but this campsite will be underwater for most of the rest of the year and may not be used again for a long time. And all I wanted last night was a cooking fire. So, it's on sand, it can't travel anywhere. I just had my fire on the sand and had one rock next to it that I could put the pan on to keep things warm, which made cleaning up the fire area fairly easy. Scatter some of the driftwood, bury some of the ashes, smooth it all out. And if we were to go back there today, or if you had gone even just a day or two after I was there, even later that day, you would have had to hunt pretty hard to find evidence of my campsite. The stool left a few holes poked in the sand, but that would be remedied fairly quickly. There was nothing left tied to the trees, and there was nothing left there at all. There's a nice feeling that comes from that, to leave the wilderness pristine. So that somebody else might come to this beach another time and they might enjoy themselves greatly because there's no evidence that I was there. Or I might come back and not have to worry about evidence that I was there. In previous campsites, I'd be able to come in and enjoy pristine wilderness again. What a beautiful morning. The lake was like glass. I'd had a good night's sleep. My belly was still full. Looking forward to coffee and a snack in a couple of hours' time after some paddling. But beginnings and starting out are actually quite a nice time.